when people are asked the question, okay, what if my child is an elect? And we're going to look at the article and how they answer it here. But one way I used to answer the question, some people have asked about, when you were a Calvinist, when you were asked this question, how did you answer it? And sometimes when when you're in your 20s, you can get away with not answering questions when you want to, or whatever else. But I remember having this discussion with somebody in my church when I was a Calvinist. In the church that I talked about in Wiley there that had split over the subject. And I don't remember the person's name that I was talking to, but they were a part of that church, and they'd heard that I was a Calvinist. And they approached me. They weren't being mean or anything, but they just approached me and just said, I heard that you were a Calvinist, and how do you deal with this? And I didn't have children at the time when this was asked. My wife may have been pregnant. Maybe that's how it came up. But I just remember them asking about children being elect, and how can you have a child, or aren't you worried about having a child if you know that they may not be elect? And those kinds of questions were coming up. And I remember how I answered, because I had heard a question answer time with R.C. Sproul several months before, because I went to one of the Ligonier conferences and he was asked the same question. And so I remember pretty much regurgitating the same answer that he gave. And my answer was this, and I was pretty proud of it at the time. And you can see how this might sound appealing for a Calvinist to say something like what I'm about to say. But I remember saying something like, well, let me ask you, would you rather the salvation of your child be in your hands, your child's hands, or God's hands? That's a pretty good way to reply, isn't it? Because I was pushing on him. I said, whose hands would you rather the salvation be? In your hands, in the child's hands, or in God's hands? And of course, they can't answer any other way but God's. Otherwise there's a problem. You have to answer, God's hands. I would rather them be in God's hands, because otherwise it's blasphemous. It's like, no, I want it on my hands. No, I want it on my child's hands. Nobody would want to say that. It's almost forcing the answer. I want it in God's hands. And that's exactly, the Calvinist says, that's exactly what we're saying. We're saying the salvation is in God's hands. And therefore you put your trust in God. And so it sounds like a really, really great answer. The problem with the answer is that you're asking someone who doesn't believe in a God who doesn't love all of his creation and want the best for all of his people. And so when a Calvinist, the premise of a Calvinist, remember, the premise of Calvinism is that God loves some people salvifically, and he hates salvifically everyone else, and has destined them for destruction before they're ever born. And so if you ask me, would you rather a God who historically saves about 5 to 10% of the population, would you rather the salvation of your child be in God's hands that does that, when he damns unconditionally the other 80 to 90%? Would you rather that be the one who decides, that version of God be the one who decides the salvation of your child, or would you rather be in your hands or your child's hands? Then my answer is probably going to be different. Why? Because on my view now, as a provisionist, if you were to ask me, would I rather the salvation be in God's hands or the child's hands, I would immediately say God's hands, because I believe God really wants the salvation of every child. And so it's real simple for me to give that answer, because I believe in the character of God, who genuinely loves and desires and wants the salvation of everyone. And so it wouldn't be a hard answer if that's the case. However, if God works like the Calvinist suggests that God works, then it would be very difficult for me to say that I want salvation to be in God's hands, when historically he's only effectually saving between 5 and 10% of the population. It seems like it just doesn't fit that way.